Thank you.
And thanks very much.
Thank you. So, hello everybody. As already said, I'm Lluís Coll. I am now a visiting professor in the University of Lleida, and I am also a researcher in Solsona. I know many of you, so I've been collaborating here, as Jordi said, with many people. And I'm still doing that, and I hope I will continue doing that. My talk, when I was invited to give this talk, first I said to myself, okay, go to Quebec, and I had to Quebec to CREAF and talk about ecology to them. It's a bit risky. So, but I do also a little bit of forest ecology. So, what I decide is actually to try to link the studies we conduct with forest management, which I think could be interesting for you. And just to position my research, and this is not to provoke, but this was the strategic plan of the Centre Tecnològic Forestal de Catalunya some years ago, we defined these three axes. And actually these three axes, many socio-ecological systems should consider these three axes in any project or in any initiative. You know that we have all the understanding and the knowledge about the functioning, how ecosystem function. I think that CREAF is very strong here. We have also the other component is about management. So we should understand how ecosystems function. We should also think into how manage them, if we should manage them. These are open questions. And then, of course, we have all these governance, socioeconomic issues. So even if we decide to manage forests in a way and we know how they work, if we don't have all these governance tools, all this knowledge is not applied anywhere. So in the context of global change, in the current context of global change, some examples of the topics that we have in these three axes. I think the computer is quite slow. Maybe here. It can be a bit risky.
Too complicated.
Okay, so everything comes at the same time. So functioning of ecosystems, what's that mean? So knowledge, for example, on these declining and drought events, pine processionary, all these projects you have about forest fires, fire regimes, etc. Then we have this management component in a context of global change. I will talk about that. Maybe promoting mixed forests. We will see when or not. Maybe applying this type of thinning or of silviculture with low densities. And then we have all this governance issue with the payment for ecosystem services, etc. My work is in between these two components. And I'm trying to do the link between them, even if this is not always easy. Why? Because to test management options, we need models, because as you know, forests grow quite slowly. This is a work we did. We asked forest managers to tell us, to the scientific community, which were the questions that worries them the more about mixed forests. This was a cost action, a pan-European project. And these 10 questions were the 10 questions we received from more than 100 forest managers of whole Europe. And then we, the researchers, we evaluate the current knowledge we have in relation to these questions. And what we realize is that in general, the questions related to whether mixed forests are more resilient or not to disturbances, or how do mixed forests affect the quantity of wood, if mixed forests were more efficient, we have quite a lot of knowledge because we have worked into that from the research perspective. In contrast, all these questions related to, how we can manage the forest, how mixed forests should be managed, which species should we promote or not, this type of issues, we don't know much about that. So it's a bit unbalanced, the knowledge we have sometimes about how the system functions and the knowledge we have into how implement this knowledge into practice. In this presentation, I will talk about three different management options for adaptation to climate change. The evidence we have on these options was analyzed in a recent paper by Albert Vilà, that you may all know, and Jordi and others. And if I have to summarize, this might be there are many options for adaptation to climate change, but The ones that we consider probably the most popular, or the ones that in which people works more, is on this issue of changing species or genetic composition, in promoting mixed forests, in reducing stand density, low density silviculture, managing the understory, this is more related to fire risk, and promoting the spatial heterogeneity of the landscape, etc. In this talk I will focus on these three management options, but rather than talk about the management options, what I would do is to present different studies we conduct and how they could be applied into them. In relation to changing species or genetic composition, we have made, well, I chose for this CREAF talk to give an overview of the research project we have been conducting in my group, in our group. So I will not go too much into the detail in the different projects. I will just present main results, but obviously if you are interested or more interested on that, we can discuss after about the different projects. So in relation to this issue, changing species or genetic composition, we have been conducting some studies. Mostly of them are focused on mountain forest, and we try to assess what were the drivers of the dynamics of these forests, because we all know, and we heard that a lot, that mountain forests are particularly vulnerable to climate change, so we were interested in advancing the knowledge of the drivers. We were also tackling this question about whether or not mountain forests were moving upwards. Maybe we could expect some species substitution in those areas, and these were different topics that I will rapidly address here. The first study I would like to present is a study that we conduct in the Pinus uncinata distribution area in Catalonia. In total, what we did was basically to compare historical aerial photograph, more than 200 photographs from the American flight, you may know, from the year 1956, to photos from 2006. And we try, in the world distribution area of Pinus uncinata, try to analyze what were the drivers or where these changes occurred, if they occurred, and what were the factors behind them. What we did in this study that was made in the context of the PhD of one of my first student, Aitor Ameztegui, that also some of you probably know. What we did is to compare these two photos, to do some to classify the images and identify the areas with some rules where encroachment and densification processes had occurred. Then what we did, and I think that was the original point of this study, is that we tried to explain this, what the occurrence of this encroachment or densification processes using topographic variables, but also socioeconomic variables, such as, for example, the population change between the 50s and the 2000s. So we went to see some statistics, population density, etc. This is what we found. We found basically this is the probability of encroachment and densification. This is also the probability. And what we found, and that surprised us a little bit, was that the probability of encroachment was higher in the at the lowest altitude of the distributional area of Pinus uncinata, and also that it mostly occurred in the shade in northern aspects. Also, I did the figure here. We found that encroachment processes and densification occur in areas with low slopes. So, in the discussion, if you get these results and you are not interested on what occurred at this socioeconomic level, we may think that maybe we have more encroachment at low altitudes because we don't have a temperature limit. So in the north, because of the absence of apparent absence of hydric stress, or in the low slopes because we have better soils. So if we have made this study only considering the topographic variables, and we have to write the discussion, that would be probably what we try to discuss. We will check the literature and you will see, well, this is what we think, or what our hypothesis. But when we look at the effect of these socioeconomic variables, densification was not much significant. Encroachment, this is the opposite, sorry. In the red, you have encroachment, okay? This you have to change. What we found is that in the areas where during these 50 years the population was reduced, we have a higher probability of encroachment, okay? And also, in the areas where the use of grasslands in these municipalities, the percentage of grasslands was low. At present, we also have more encroachment. So, well, I'll go quite rapid about that, but the issue here and what we realize is that these topographic variables are somehow related to land use changes. And when you talk with people in the Pyrenees or you check a little bit the literature, you would see that the low altitudes that for Pinus uncinata correspond to the high altitudes for culture and grasslands. Okay, Pinus uncinata distributes from 1,600 to maybe 2,500. So the pastures and the cultures that were firstly abandoned in the 50s were the ones that were distributed at the higher altitude in relation to this use, which correspond to the lowest altitude of pine. We also know, talking with the people, that the first cultures and grasslands that were abandoned in the north face. We are talking about on mountain areas, okay? So, in general, in these areas, the pastures that remain and the grasslands are located in southern slopes. And, of course, lower slopes and better soils correspond to areas that were cultured in the past. So, what we realized, or what we indirectly showed in this study, was that we had these two components that were somehow related, and land use change seemed to explain most of these processes of encroachment and densification. Because we were quite happy about that, we decided to continue exploring all these dynamics of these systems. In all the presentation I do, I put this because this is my photo and we had the cover, so I'm very happy about that. I remind but they made some Instagram, some treatment of the image because it's more contrasted than the original. But anyway, we tried to analyze in a second study, not only these encroachment and densification processes, but whether this tree line is moving upwards or not. For that, what we did is to draw the tree line in the year 1956. This was through the analysis of this aerial photograph. Of course, we should consider some errors on that, but we did as well as we could. We also draw the tree line in the year 2006, and then we use a potential tree line that was established in a study by Carreras and Ninot, that was actually drawn regarding to the composition and some topographic variables that they study in the Pyrenees. What they did is that they identified different topographic units. They look whether in these topographic units they found or not trees of a certain height. They also look at the floristic community, and then, like we did in these niche models, they project and they said, okay, so if we find here trees in these particular topographic conditions and these communities, even if we don't find trees in other areas, we may expect that they could grow there. So we have these three lines, okay, the one in the 56, in the 2006, and the one written, this potential tree line. And then what we analyzed first was whether the tree line moved between the 56 and the 2006. We did that comparing cells. Well, this is a bit more complicated, but what we find, and this is what you have to retain, is that almost 60% of the cells we analyzed, there was almost no change of tree line. We find also 5% of cells in which we had a retreat, and 32% of the cells in which we saw an advance. In any case, this advance is very, very, very low. We are talking about 35 meters. Okay, so the tree line dynamics are slow processes. We need the trees to disperse the seeds to survive, to grow, etc. But this is what we found. But more interestingly, when we relate the advance, the shift in the position of the tree line with this proxy of anthropogenic disturbance, which is actually the distance between the tree line in the 50s and the potential tree line, this is a bit, I will try to explain that better. If we have a huge distance between the tree line in the 50s and the potential tree line, we may expect that if we don't have trees there, we could have put the hypothesis that this is because of anthropogenic use, because of pastures, or we have some cows, or anyway. So the more the difference between the tree line in the 50s and the potential tree line, we can expect that this was due to as a proxy of land use. Okay, so what we found here was that the closest or the lowest the distance was between the tree line and the potential tree line, the lowest the displacement of the tree line between the two studied periods. Whereas when we have room for displacement, that is that the potential tree line is much higher than the current tree line in the 50s, we had more advance. At the end, this is not as surprising. What we did is when you have some room to progress, this is where you progress. But at the end, the important and the take-home message is that land use changes seems to be driven, at least during this period, the advance of the tree line. So in the literature you will find, and the Swiss are very good on that, they have studied this tree line and they relate that with climate change. In our case, when we use some climatic model, we didn't find relations between the differences in temperature and the tree line dynamics. We found differences when we used these proxies of land use. Do these results mean that temperature, climate warming is not having any influence on tree line dynamics or displacement? No. The only thing we said is that land use changes seem the prominent factor, which is very logical if you know the pyrenids, at least in this system. So then we had also some studies that we conduct at not at the tree line, but at the ecotone between the mountain forest, that, as you know, is mostly dominated by pine, Pinus sylvestris and some fir, and this mountain pine forest. And to try to study whether we may expect a displacement, or whether or not pines or birch or mountain species could do well when growing in the subalpine, we established experimental plantation a few years ago, in which we established different plots in natural gaps and also under the shade of the overstory, and we plant into this into 12 in total plots different species that coexist in this mountain subalpine ecotone. But we also replicate the same experimental plantation in 2,000 meters, so at the subalpine belt. So this was an experimental plantation to see if with the time we just to compare how these mountain species, Abies alba or Pinus sylvestris of Betupendula, how they did in the subalpine, and what differences would we find between the two altitudinal stages. And basically, this is an image of the plantation. We had to protect the plants. What we found, and this may not surprise you, is that after 3 years, we had a very cold winter. This is solid lines is the recorded temperature. This is the normal. Here you have the snow depth. Here you have the minimum temperature. So the winter of 2010, we have very, very low temperatures and also a very low snow depth. So in that conditions, under this extreme cold period, what we found was that Pinus sylvestris, which is the mountain species, had declined and had important mortality there. Birch did more or less well, and as you could see, Pinus uncinata more or less grow the same in the mountain that in the subalpine, was a species that really did well. Contrary to that, we had a particular warm summer, the other summer, and fir in the mountain stage decrease its survival. The home message is something that you know, that this type of extreme events are very important for the regeneration of these areas. And we are used to analyze and to study big trees, but what happens with regeneration is probably the bottleneck explaining the consequence of climate change on the dynamics of at least of these systems. Another result that we had was that light in mountain areas at this level, at the subalpine level, at the mountain subalpine ecotone, that light was the main environmental factor controlling height growth. And when we talk about light in forestry, we talk about the structure of the forest and about the density. So microsite factors such as light availability at the level of the top of the seedlings, or also the presence of the shrubby layer, they were very important determining the survival and the growth in that case of this species. And this is something that we are now working on. This is the forest species in the mountain and in the subalpine ecotone. What we see was that the response to light vary depending on the stage where the species develop. And this was particularly true by Pinus uncinata, which is the subalpine species. Pinus uncinata was able to change the allocation of biomass when developing in the mountain and in the subalpine ecotone, whether the mountain species such as Pinus sylvestris or birch and even fir, they were not as able as Pinus uncinata to modify their allocation. The same occurred with some leaf traits. So, a bit of conclusion of all these studies. What we saw in these studies was that subalpine forests have undergone significant encroachment and densification processes. You all know that forest has colonized most of the abandoned fields. That tree line seems to be driven by the past history of anthropogenic disturbances. Then the tree line has still room for further upward displacement. So Pinus uncinata, we should not be a priori much worried about this species. That short periods of extreme climate events have strong impacts in the mortality of the species growing away from their mean elevation range. So caution to put the species, to move the species upwards. And also that light availability and forest structure and microsite conditions are critical factors determining growth and survival. Okay, so what's the consequence of that for the management? I said that I was talking about management. And actually, I will explain an anecdote. Of course, because we conduct these studies, this is La Cerdanya, in this county, we had a lot of contact with the managers. And during a field trip, I asked to the manager of La Cerdanya, that many of you may know, this guy here. I asked him what was his main worry or problem when managing this forest, this Pinus uncinata forest. And of course, I was a bit biased, I expect this climate change issue or maybe some pathogens or some pests. And what he said was that the main problem he needs to address is that all the forests he managed have more or less the same age. So they have more or less 70 to 80 years, the same structure. And this was because they come from the same process that was this abandonment of lands. So he has a huge area of forest, more or less from the same age. Then if you want to make some cuttings and to regenerate, you will need to cut them at the same moment. If you have a problem, you have the same problem everywhere. And he said that this is my main problem, that I have the forests, they all look like the same, so I need, and he do some efforts to create some heterogeneity in the forest. How to create this heterogeneity, and this is something we have been working a little bit with, is to create, for example, to opening some gaps, try to see what is the optimum size of these gaps to allow the regeneration, respecting also species different to the main, etc. But just keep into that. In the mountain systems, yes, we have this climatic problem, but land uses were very, very, very strong there, and they have a huge impact into the dynamics and into the management of the systems. The second managing option for adaptation to climate change, as you may know, is promoting mixed forests. And what we ask in our group, we did some studies more or less related to that. We ask ourselves whether these mixed forests have greater resistance or resilience. Also, we try to analyze which species should we promote, where, and how. And I will first try to answer or address the first question, presenting you a study that was developed by a student of us, Martina Sánchez-Pinillos, published a couple of years ago. And what we did in this study was basically to select for all the tree species growing in the Iberian Peninsula 6 response traits to disturbances, and try to see whether these species have these traits or not. In general, when we talk about plant traits, we used to think into specific leaf area or maximum height or growth rate, etc. These are all traits related to fitness, to growth, but we have also a number of traits that are more related to the capacity of the plants to respond to disturbances, such as, for example, the presence of roots, of depth roots, or the sprouting ability, etc. So what we did was to select 6 traits and just put a 1 and a 0 to all the species in the inventory. We developed some criteria. So just to note whether these traits were present or not in these species. This is an example of the distribution of the traits in the species. As you could see from the 140 species that we checked, 100 has this sprouting ability that, as you may know, is very present in plants. Also in the Mediterranean or in the Iberian Peninsula, we have species and plants with depth roots, etc. And then once we had that, we calculate an index that we call the persistence index. The first author of the study is Pinillos, so we call it in our group the Pinillos index. And what this index reflects is that it's composed by 2 parts, by 2 factors. The first relates to the trait richness, whether these response traits were present or not in the communities. And of course, we have also another factor related to the abundance of these traits in the community. We use the canopy cover as a measure to calculate the abundance of the traits. And this is what we obtain. We take the data and the plots from the National Forest Inventory, and based on the composition, this was very simple, but based on the composition of these plots and the cover of each species, we calculate this persistence index, and that was a little bit the image we had at the national level. With, as you see, all the forest in Catalonia seems to do quite well compared to others in terms of their persistence capacity to disturbance. If we check at the value that this index takes among different forest types, as you could see, mixed forests have in general an index that is above the mean. This is mostly because the more species we have in our forest, the more the probability is to find different response traits. Even if this saturates to 3 to 4 species, at the moment increasing the number of species do not increase this index because most of these traits were already present. But eucalyptus forests, some more specific forests like that, they are also very persistent because we have only one species, but we have many of these traits into a single species. Okay, so this is an index we are now working to it, trying to validate it with data, but that at least I think that what is interesting in this study is this concept of response traits, that there are some people working on that, but that I think could be quite used to address whether forests are or not, have or not this recovery capacity to disturbances. So in the Mediterranean areas, which species should we promote? Well, this is an example of a plot we have in near Solsona. This was affected by the forest in the 20 years ago. And in Solsona we know, this is an old pine that survived the forest, but we know that the recovery capacity of this forest, or at least whether we have woody vegetation on that, depends on the presence of oak in the understory previously to the fire. As you know, this fire affects mostly Pinus nigra, Pinus sylvestris. These species don't have serotinous cones, they don't regenerate well after the fire if they burn completely, but in their understory they used to have some Quercus species that resprout very vigorously after the fire. So, of course, having these oaks in the understory is very important. This is a work we did in this burn area, at least in a portion of burn area. This is we combine information from satellite images and also some information for some LiDAR flights, and we could classify different types of communities after the fire, 15 years after the fire. You could see that this methodology, we identified the areas that didn't burn, the areas that were now occupied by oaks, etc. And what was interesting, if you look at the occurrence of oak, that oaks mainly occur now, this resprouting, in the areas distributed at the lowest altitude and in the north. So these were areas favorable for the oaks. The Despelta, which is not here, found similar results using data from the National Forest Inventory. But most important was that oaks occur when in the 50s we have already the forest established there. Okay, so oaks need some time to establish underneath the pines, and of course the history of these forests, whether they were already forest in the 50s or not, condition the presence of oak in the understory, and also explains the presence of these vigorous resprouts of oak after the fire. So from the management perspective, if we have a forest like that, we might probably be interested into promoting these species of oaks here. Okay. And the problem we have when we go into the forest, and if we did some transects to that, was that we find in the understory of the pines many seedlings of evergreen oaks or Marcescent oaks, but not much saplings of that. This is something that occurs a lot into the pine woods. If you walk into these sub-Mediterranean pine woods, you will find many seedlings, many oaks like that, but not much of that size. We try to study why, and this is something that we already know, but that we characterize it here. What happens with these species is that the requirements for the seedlings are not the same than for the saplings. Here we sampled some gaps in the area of Solsona, and this is the percentage or the density of oaks. You have Marcescent oaks and evergreen oaks in function of canopy openness, and what you see was that the optimal openness for the seedlings of Marcescent oaks was a bit low than the optimal openness for the development of saplings. But this is much more accentuated in the case of evergreen. When you check the optimal canopy openness for the presence of seedlings, you see that at about 20 to 25% of openness they do quite well, but if you want to find saplings, you need much more openness. So well, we analyze also different aspects about the gaps, the mean gap size, etc. This is I will not go into that. We also analyze whether this shrubby cover facilitates or not the presence of oak, but at the end, what we need to know and what we characterize was the exigencies of the seedlings and the saplings and the need for the saplings of increasing the level of openness. So how to do that? Well, we can do that in several ways. The first is try to go to the field, and when we do some regeneration cuttings, try to respect all the oaks of all the species that present different regeneration strategies than the main ones. And this is what we did here. Here we did some openings in Scots pine stands, and in the openings we respect all the oaks we find developing in the understory after the cuttings. So in these areas we may expect some regeneration of Scots pine, but we will also have all these oaks that are present here. This is something that I think that forest managers do more and more. Okay, before I think some years ago when we did these operations, we manage the understory for the workers and we eliminate all what we find. Now I think that we try to respect the presence of other species. And of course, and this is very, very important, to have oaks in the understory of the pines, we need seed sources and preserving legacies, such as these big oaks that testify from past uses. This was a pasture, it looks like a reforestation, but it is not. Preserving this type of trees is very important for the natural diversification of the stands. This is something that we did in this life project that I would like to mention. It is called Mix for Change. We go to the field and we try to diversify the forest by giving more light to these oak or broadleaf species that are dominated by the pines. We are also establishing some sensors. This is soil water sensors to try to see whether these treatments have an effect or not, and we have also some publications that if you are interested in that you can consult. And finally, regarding this issue of diversifying forest, I would like to present very rapidly an experience that we did in which we tried to promote the diversification of the pine woods by planting species, different species, sprouting species and different provenances. And the idea with that treatment is to establish inside the forest a small community of oaks or other species that would be then able to disperse, and then they act as a dispersion focus, a diversification focus for the rest of the forest. This is something that in Canada is now more and more developed. The idea is, as I mentioned, to select some forests that are very monospecific or very vulnerable and try to help and assist the diversification of these forests for the future. What we did in this experiment, we select 3 different mountain range in the Pre-Pyrenees, and then we also select within each range 3 different altitudes. We select gaps, we select closed overstory, and we establish into some plots 4 species of oaks. Also we establish beech and sorghum area, and from these 3 oaks we used 2 different provenances. And this was something I would like to check at that time, is that the use of more Mediterranean provenances in those areas to test whether they could do well or not. We can talk about assisted migration if you want. We take some plants or some, in that case, some provenances from the Mediterranean, try to see whether they grow well or not. And that's what we did. And we are still working on this experiment. We also do some seeding, because when you establish plants, the plants have 2 years old, the biomass is distributed in a way that is maybe not natural, so we also did some seeding. And we look at the emergence, at the survival, and into the sprouting capacity of these species. And similarly to what I presented before, we had a winter. The first winter was abnormally cold and dry. These are the precipitation, the minimum temperature, and we have a summer abnormally dry and warm. So again, if you look at the different species, this is at low, intermediate, and high altitude after this winter, particularly cold. At the higher altitude, Quercus coccifera and Quercus ilex, we found some huge mortality there. So again, these extreme events putting into trouble the regeneration or the survival of these species. When we look at the gaps and try to see whether the species do better under the shade or in natural gaps, we found that in general, in gaps, we found more mortality. So all these oaks, as we already said before, they need some shade in the first stages. And then what I think, we could not go much further on that, but it seemed we saw huge differences between provenance in Quercus ilex, but both oaks did more or less the same. So of course we would need more provenances and go a little bit further on that, but the genetic component seems to vary depending on the species in that case. Okay, and in general the Mediterranean species did worse, so we found more mortality than the local ones. This is a summary of the results. With Quercus coccifera, of course, that was the more Mediterranean species, so at high altitude we find some mortality, but more tolerance to low temperatures than expected. We find some plants developing and surviving at 1,000 and some meters, which is not bad. Quercus ilex, we don't see any effect of the canopy cover, but some signs of high ecotypic differentiation, as I mentioned. Whether the other Quercus, the Marcescent Quercus, the canopy cover in that case was very important for them, but they seem to show less ecotypic differentiation. What we, just for if you are curious, what we have done, we are now studying in these systems. These plants have now they are in their 6th growing season, and what we did with a colleague, with Pere Casals, we simulate a browsing, and we cut all the plants, and then what we want to see now is how they resprout and the resprouting capacity depending on the origin of the plants and all these conditions. We'll see what we'll have. So in summary, the resilience of the mixtures might be mediated by the diversity and redundancy of traits relevant to the tree response. The history of previous use determines in many cases the recovery capacity. Current levels of canopy closure allows the establishment of Quercus, but hampers the growth of established oaks. This is something that we know, but we demonstrate quite well in our study. And we give some thresholds that I think forest managers could use. And there are many opportunities for forest diversification. And again, extreme climatic events should be considered during the early stages in these regeneration programs. And finally, I will talk very rapidly about a study that we did and in which we tried to see whether reduction of stand density was interesting from the perspective of the water balance. And this is a modelization exercise. Well, this is just a photo of Pinus olepensis stand that I visit close to Lleida. That was really dense. This is how it looks like last year. Now they did some thinnings. I think that from the perspective of the forest, that would be much better. But what we did in this study is to combine two different models, the sortie model, which is an individual based model of forest dynamics, and the med-fate model, that is the model of water balance that was created by Michael and Jordi and their respective groups. And what we did in this modeling exercise that I think is quite interesting and could be replicated is to select 3 different sites. We have a Mediterranean gradient within them, from a more xeric site to a humid site, and we look at the climatic conditions of these sites. We also use 3 climatic scenarios. We combine, and we test the effect of 8 silvicultural treatments. These are reductions of basal area in each of these 3 sites and 3 climatic scenarios. With the sortie model, we made the forest grow after the thinnings. The sortie model, the growth of the trees depends on is a spatially explicit model, so it depends on the neighbors, on the size of the neighbors and the climate. And we made the forest grow in response to these treatments, and then we calculate with med-fate the water balance in these stands, the interception, the transpiration, etc. So sortie and the growth we had give us an idea on the productivity of the stands, and med-fate provides some information on the water stress and also on the production of blue water, etc. So that allowed us to analyze the trade-off between, in that case, productivity, wood production, and blue water, etc. And these are the results. So here you have, these are the 3 different climatic scenarios. This is no climate change, and the 2 climatic scenarios considered. And this is the thinning intensity, okay? And the final basal area, I think it was 100 after the treatments. In general, what you find is that if you apply some thinnings, you can increase the final basal area because trees have more space to grow. So, of course, if you thin too much, then you will never recuperate the basal area that you would have without thinning. So, this is something that we could expect in the humid sites, more productivity than in the xeric ones. And if you look, and this is what was interesting, this was one of the outputs of the model, the stress index. If we fix it to 0.5 as a threshold, you could see that in the humid sites, we should not be much worried about it. I mean, whether we do or not thinnings into them, we are quite well. Even in the worst scenario of climate, our trees seems not to be much stressed. Whether, contrary to that, in the xeric sites, to have levels of stress below 50%, if we consider that this is the threshold, we should apply thinnings of reductions of about 50 to 60 of the basal area, which is not much realistic. So maybe in these sites where we have pines now, if we think into the future, the persistence of this species, I'm not sure it would be possible. Maybe we could think into other species that would be more adapted to that. Whether in the case of mesic sites, under the 2 climatic scenarios, well, depending on the climatic scenario considered, yes, we are able, through thinnings, to reduce the stress to levels that seems to be acceptable, but the thinnings are rather important. We are talking about removing 30% of the basal area. And of course, we have some thresholds reducing basal area to increase or to reduce the stress of trees means also having less wood, and all this trade-off between wood production and, in that case, blue water or the reduction of stress should be considered. These type of treatments of reducing the density of the stands are now tested in the context of this canopy project. This is an Interreg project. We have some plots in the area that burn in '98 that resprout. We are trying to see thinning treatments in the oaks are improving the state of these stands, and these treatments are replicated a little bit everywhere. I know that in Scotspan you have also some treatments in which you apply some thinnings to improve blue water. I think that now in Southern Europe we have many of these trials, and maybe one day it would be quite useful to put all this together. And in summary, and this is the last slide, so hydrology-oriented silviculture can be an interesting option to increase the resistance. In some particular sites, like in the Cherrick age, even heavy repeated thinnings may not be enough to alleviate drought. In domestic and humid areas, a compromise between the maintenance of stand production and the improvement of blue water provisioning or drought stress relief could be achieved through thinnings. But this is like the most important message, that we are against general management recommendations that don't take into account the site conditions and thinning intensities. So we still need more research to know what treatments to apply in each site, because we know that depending on the site quality and the conditions, we would need to apply a thinning intensity or another. So to conclude, some keywords that summarize our studies and our vision of this forest management for adaptation. First is to put the accent into forest structure. It is much more sexy to talk on forest composition, but forest structure, we know that it has a prominent role in regeneration, in growth, etc. Land use changes, do not forget about land use changes, particularly if we work in mountain areas, because they explain many things. And related to that, the importance of legacies, mostly in these diversification processes. We need seed sources to diversify forests, and having some trees from the past, very important for that. Heterogeneity, as I mentioned, in mountain areas, we have a lot of an homogeneous landscape, higher fire risk, etc. So try to create heterogeneity. Focus not only on fitness, but also in these response traits to disturbances. Consider, and you know you do that, the importance of extreme events, because they are a key issue in regeneration. It is much more easy to work with adult trees, but we don't know almost anything about regeneration. And in the forest dynamics models, we need information on regeneration, and we lack this information. And the problem with regeneration is that 3 years after 3 years old plants are still continue to be very vulnerable to a drought event. So this is something that we should consider. Assisted migration, I don't know. We made some tests with some provenances. This is something that maybe requires more research. It's a controversial issue. And also, of course, all this trade-off between services. And that's all. Just to thank Martin, Aitor, and Santi. Most of the studies were from there. These were PhD students in my group. Michael and Pere, that are the researchers with whom I collaborate the most. And of course, my colleagues, José, Christian, Brotons, Alejandra, Miriam, etc., that have also participated in all the works I present. And thank you. That's it.
Any questions? Yes.
So thanks for the talk. That was really interesting. I had a question about your tree line data, and I was wondering, it sounds like the distance between tree line and potential tree line is driven by anthropogenic events, And I was wondering what those are and whether those have any relationships to other environmental variables.
Yes. Well, first of all, this was the hypothesis that we did, okay? And it was very risky. When we sent the paper for revision, we said for sure reviewers will say that this is maybe speculation. But we know from the use that many of, in less mountainous areas, at the top of the mountains we have pastures. And we know that historically the farmers they go to the mountains and they let the sheep and the cows there. So they were, I think at the top of our mountains at these altitudes of 2,000 meters, they were in the past pasture. So we think that this is probably one of the causes that explain these differences between the potential tree line and the tree line in the 50s. Okay. Now we know that it is becoming hard for these people to bring. It's a hard work to go to the pastures in the mountains. So we know some areas in the Pyrenees where this is still made, but it is an activity that is much less frequent now than in the past. So we think that that was probably what explained that. And also we have some cultures in the 50s in the mountain areas where we have some soil. People in the villages, they cultivate vegetables or grasslands. So from our perspective, the only thing that we think can explain these huge differences sometimes between the potential tree line and the tree line in the 50s is anthropogenic use. But we don't know exactly what.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome.
I have one. When you were discussing the regeneration of oaks under the pine canopy, you were showing this data showing that frequently there are lots of seedlings and very few saplings. I wonder how exactly you establish the difference between seedling and sapling, and that simply because from experience, sometimes we did that using size, based on size, not age, and you may find really tiny oaks that may be very old.
Yes.
Waiting for. So
Yes.
I don't know whether
Yes.
you use
No.
age or size.
No. For sure, we were. Maybe seedling and sapling is not the better term for that. We were talking about the height of the plants. But I fully agree with you that you can have some oaks like that have 20, 25 years and roots like this. And actually that's when the fire in the 98 occurred. All this resprouting of oaks surprised a lot the people because they couldn't see these oaks in the understory of the pines, and that was because they were like that. They die, but the root system of these oaks is probably like that. So, yeah, you're right that it is not only a matter of size, but also of the age. In any case, what we think is that. If all your forest is made with these young oaks, from the point of view of the recovery capacity, that's fine, they will resprout. But if you want to have some regeneration in these oaks, a dynamic forest, we think that it is quite important to allow these oaks to grow and to produce some acorns, etc. This is more from this perspective that we think that is interesting too.
The implications are a bit different because if you think about them as saplings, as something that is very vulnerable to any extreme event, it's one scenario. If you think about them as rather old, small plants that are basically waiting and could be waiting for decades until the appropriate conditions just occur, then the implications are, because it's exactly the same that we find with drought-induced mortality.
Mm-hmm.
Pine canopy dies, and then there were some tiny oaks there, and within a few years they grow like mad. And
yeah.
I don't know, maybe 5 years you already have a canopy of oaks there. So Quite impressive.
Yes, I agree. Maybe is the maybe as a foresters we have all this drive. We like to see some trees that are at the reproductive stage. I don't know how. So, but I agree with you that the presence of these oaks, no matter the size, is it's fine for the recovery capacity. Yeah.
Fantastic. With so many people, it should be.
So I was interested in your transplant experiment, growing up in elevation with the 4 species. I thought that was quite interesting, and I suppose you discussed it more in the context almost of the implications for the management. But I suppose the main implications would be the context of climate change.
Yeah, sure.
And so if I remember correctly from the slide, one of the species that responded less well was the Scots pine, which showed during the extreme event some mortality. Is that correct?
But we have 2 experiments with elevation gradients. One was in the Pyrenees, and what we did was take Scots pine and put it into the subalpine stage. Yeah. And there we had some problems, but with cold events. But the experiment with different provenances was using we use only Quercus species sprouting.
So I was referring to the.
Okay.
And so I thought it was remarkable. How do you explain that Scots pine, which is really a boreal species, and here we are at the southern extreme distribution of Scots pine. If anything, I would think species which show this kind of response should be the ones which are at their northern limit. You move them up and they suffer because of an extreme event. Here we have a species which is the southern distribution limit. You move them up a little bit and there is a little bit of extra cold and they die. So how do you explain that?
Well, first this was a planting experience. So the origin of our plants were more or less the same. They were not exactly for the mountain range. So I think we should have here some genetic issues for sure. They come from what we call the temperate zone, not far from where we established them. But we could think if we would have some seeds from the Scots pine that were growing there, and we produce some plants and we establish them, if we would find the same results, I don't know. But what it seems, according to these results, and was, even if, as you mentioned, Scots pine, you can find it everywhere, there is this ecotypic differentiation which is very, very accentuated, at least in our study. But I'm not able to explain that more. We always think into these studies whether if we would have find the same effects if we would seed the seeds and then maybe the allocation of biomass, I don't know. So it is always, I am myself a bit critic on that. But what we find for sure was that cold event 3 years after the planting, not the same year. So we have a reduction on mortality, yeah. So actually, if I have to make a, we say that maybe Scots pine will take some distribution area of Pinus uncinata and will displace the species. I'm not at all sure about that. Because of this extreme event and because of the capacity of Pinus uncinata, did very well at the lowest altitude.
So what exactly was the extreme event? Was it a very cold temperature?
Yeah, it was the combination of very cold temperature and the absence of snow.
Yeah.
So we have, because the snow protects in those areas the plants. So we have a thin snow and very, very cold.
And this is the middle of the winter or spring or summer?
That was in the, I think in December.
December?
Yeah, but I will check after. Yeah. We didn't have a reduction of 50% of plants, but we could see the mortality occur. Yeah. I think I like that. I think that trying to see what are different provenances or different origin of plants, because In forestry, we use these provenances. When we plant our forest, we have to look to the adequate provenances, and this is maybe with climate change is something that we can discuss whether we should rethink on that or not. And it is not easy to find studies on that. And this is for the anecdote. For me, we wrote in the title, we wrote the paper and we put a system migration there, but I said, well, it's a bit risky. But in any case, we discussed a little bit on that. And the paper was accepted, and we had the editorial of the journal in Applied Vegetation Science. They present our paper, a researcher from the States saying that we need, so it's something that I think is still lacking, this type of at least in natural conditions. We have these provenance trials, but take plants and put them into different conditions, natural conditions. I think this is something interesting. Yes?
I was also thinking about the role of snow, big winter, and a major factor for
Yes.
And what is your opinion about the role of shrubs as protective elements, especially those years where you have very little snow and snow gets trapped, and so the occurrence of the patchy acid structure
Yes.
with the recruitment of trees. So I wonder if
There are two implications. Yeah, I didn't show, but we find some positive effect of these shrubs on the survival of Scots pine at higher altitude. So we find some facilitation, not only to snow, but because I didn't show that, we protect the half of the plants, the other half were less unprotected. And because we want also to see whether the browsing change between the gaps and the dense forest. And we also saw that snow had an effect in protecting the plants from the browsing. So we find the relationship between the browsing and the openness of the canopy. So yes, these shrubs have an effect improving the microclimate conditions of the plants, but also in reducing some of the shrubs, the probability of browsing.
I think they might have an increasing importance, especially if you have more years with less snow, because only where you have this snow trapping snow, you might survive.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting. I've never thought into the interaction of the shrubs and the snow more, and yeah. Mm. Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned these forests are young, no? 50, 60 years.
80.
So, if you suppose a scenario, the forest was 400 years old, the heterogeneity will be different than the actual heterogeneity, or you need always to manage the system to create heterogeneity, or the system by itself can create heterogeneity? No, but this is something that we know. With management, what we do is accelerate some dynamic, natural dynamic processes that it would occur maybe at other scales or in another way. Of course, if we don't do anything, sooner or later we would have some disturbances there, and that would create some heterogeneity. This is not something that we should. Yeah, it is a way of accelerating the process at the end. This is mostly what forest management do. When we do regeneration cuttings, it doesn't mean that this forest would not regenerate without the regeneration cuttings, but if we want to do it at year 100, because we think that the forest would not grow more, we cut the trees and we have the regeneration there. But of course, if we don't cut them, we have the regeneration, but after a windstorm or when the trees will fall down naturally, yeah. 400 years, I don't know, because I'm not sure, yeah. This reminds me, Christian Messier, that you know here, a Canadian researcher that is always asking me when he came here,
what's the natural forest here? That would be, I don't know. And once I went with my former professor of silviculture, and I said to Christian, ask him what's the natural forest there. He was there. And he looked at me, what is he asking? What's that question? We don't know. So 400 years old forest, we don't know.
Okay.
Okay.
There are no more questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.